Welcome to this edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. It is the afternoon of Friday, May 12th, 2017. We are in the midst of a constitutional crisis. It is quite possibly one of the 4 or 5 or certainly half dozen most severe crises we've had in American history. We've had a civil war brought on with the help of Andrew Jackson several decades before, who put us on the skids towards a civil war. We've had a long crisis of economic depression from 1932-33, the nonfeasance of Herbert Hoover acting according to the dictates of his free market philosophy or belief structure. There was also the question of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in 1936 and 37, invalidating all the New Deal legislation in the name of the reactionary cause that couldn't win at the polls but thought it could hang on through the Supreme Court. So we can count the Depression as 1 or 2 constitutional crises. In the period 1972 through 1974, we had the Watergate scandal, the Watergate crisis. That seems to be the closest in form and to some degree in content to what we've got going today. But remember also, there was a Vietnam War going for all of that time, and there was also a war in the Middle East, the Kippur War, at the time of the infamous Saturday Night Massacre, October 20th, 1973. There was a war going on in the Middle East with Kissinger, whom we saw at the White House this week through some arcane mechanism. Kissinger was flying to meet Brezhnev in Moscow to talk about what to do about the Arab-Israeli war, Egypt and Syria, and Jordan in particular, against the Israelis. But now we've had other constitutional crises too. These are the most severe. Now we have Trump. We have the Trump administration. I would submit that among all organs of news and broadcasting and opinion, this one here, the one you're listening to right now, is the one that has had it right about the true meaning of this effort from the very earliest days. So we're in the midst of a constitutional crisis. It means that people have to accept the special responsibility of activism. This is no time for the idiocy of private life. You'll remember the Greeks thought that the true expression of humanity was to be involved in the life of the polis. That meant be political, have a care about your polis. Well, it's time now to break out of an alienation, a disorientation, a despair, passivity, resignation that have lasted for decades. For some, they've never known anything else. Now it's time to act. As we've often said, get active or get radioactive. Those are the possibilities. And naturally, we've already seen unmistakable signs of a regime which is inclined, some would say already addicted, to seek popularity and adulation and better polling numbers through aggression in other parts of the world. So get active. And in this context, let me say right off the bat, there is here in Washington on Saturday, June 3rd, there's something that bills itself as the March for Truth. And they have some demands. We discussed their demands this week at the other program, The American System, Monday through Thursday, americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. Go and subscribe. You can't make it in this world now without getting a briefing every day from yours truly, because we can put it together. This June 3rd meeting, rally, march, protest can become very large. It can become decisive at this point, because it now, thanks to events really more than to any leadership, it has an implicit program. Get the truth about Russiagate and bring on justice even if the heavens fall, right? Fiat justitia ruat caelum. So let it happen. And you got to be part of that. So I urge people to save that date. And if you have a member of Congress who has a town hall meeting, you got to get in there. This has been done now. There are excellent models of intervention that are on the internet, on YouTube and so forth. And it's time now for a great political rebirth of the American people and far beyond. It's great to have 5 million people in the streets, but what was the demand? There was no demand. That women are good? Yeah, great. It's something everybody can subscribe to. Every member of Congress will tell you they already are. But now it's got to be specific. Now there's got to be a special prosecutor, and there's got to be either a large joint committee of the Congress, House and Senate, on the Iran-Contra Inouye committee model, and or a repeat but open, with more scrutiny and more skepticism of the Kane-Hamilton 9/11 commission of about 12, 13 years ago. So that's my call to people. It's a call to action. It's a call to activism. We have the program that's necessary on all of these questions, be it the healthcare front, economic recovery. 30 plus 10 million new jobs makes 40 million new jobs. We have all that paid for by the Federal Reserve and paid for by Wall Street. And remember that the presence of Trump in terms of the Wall Street backers is to get certain things done, right? They want to have legislation to favor themselves, of course, but in a broader sense, they also want to distract attention from themselves. In other words, do you know what J.P. Morgan Chase did last week, or Citibank, or Goldman Sachs? You don't really know that, because we're forced to fight on this other front, and we've got to bear that in mind. We want to get back to the time when the attention can be focused on zombie bankers and hedge fund hyenas, and not on this essentially expendable deployment politically that they've put forward. Now, the atmosphere today, if you were walking in Midtown Manhattan, in the area of the intersection of 5th Avenue and 59th Street, you might have seen Melissa McCarthy, the comic actress, the comedienne, dressed as Sean Spicer, the White House spokesman. She was running a motorized White House press conference podium. She was in the Manhattan traffic, and she was angrily demanding that everybody get out of her way so that she can go forward. And this foreshadows maybe another turning point in this crisis. On the evening of Saturday, the 13th of June, as many of you are hearing this first time, don't forget that on the evening of Saturday, June 13th, there's going to be a Saturday Night Live episode hosted by Melissa McCarthy, who presumably is going to do her Sean Spicer routine. So that is something to look forward to. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome to World Crisis Radio. As I just mentioned, we do have a program from Monday through Thursday. It's called The American System. You must subscribe. You must tune in. It's the price of a cappuccino frappuccino. I think the $7 rate is the basic subscription. You can upgrade that to a pro-agitation contribution, please do if you can. But the basic is you got to listen to this. 50 cents per episode, a mere bagatelle for anybody. So you've got to go to americansystem.tv. Now, we also have to thank the people of France, right? Before we go any further, this week has been so tumultuous that it seems like the French election was several months ago. But we have to remember that the essential structure and geometry of the world as we have known it, the world of our time, was very much at stake in that French election, perhaps more than in the American election. The United States has strong institutions. They fight back. They're resilient. We have a very strong civil society. In France, you have a strong Fifth Republic, but it's also brittle. And if Marine Le Pen were now on her way towards taking over the French presidency with the sweeping, matchless powers of the French president, greater powers than the American president has, fewer checks, fewer balances over there, we would be now in a critical situation, much worse than what we're in. Right now, I would say the tide has turned. The public reaction to the Trumpgate monstrosity has shown an awakening of the American people. You might say, nothing concentrates the mind than like the knowledge that someone wants to kill you. And as we've seen in these town hall meetings, people are now getting to be very much aware that the revolutionary Republican Party is determined to adopt policies which will lead to 45,000 needless deaths per year, and from there on up, for the purpose of gratifying their predatory, parasitical donor base of billionaires reaching into the Oval Office. And people are not happy. They will not go gentle into that bad night of essentially departing this world for the sake of Republican promises. They say, well, we ran on this in so many elections. That's your problem, buddy. So this is now this awakening. But again, merci la France for the defeat of Le Pen, right? This scurrilous candidate who was supposed to become the keystone of a nihilist international. This was, of course, the great aspiration of Bannon and company, that between Wilders and Le Pen and the Alternatives for Germany, they hoped to get some kind of a international movement going that would sweep across the world with nihilism, xenophobia, racism, fear, a new dark age, really, a new dark age based on nihilism. Well, that's not going so well, and I'm looking now to Rhine and Ruhr. I'm looking for failure, places that I've frequented: Cologne, Düsseldorf, Dortmund, Essen, all of these places. The most important federal state of Germany, 18 or 19 million people. They're voting tomorrow, on Sunday the 14th, and we're hoping for a victory of democratic forces that stand on the ground of the German Constitution, the Grundgesetz, and that not Alternatives for Germany, which is no alternative. God, that's a Hobson's choice. Hobson's choice for Germany, meaning damned if you do and damned if you don't once you go with those guys. So don't do it. That party seems to be falling apart because of its own internal heteronomy, right? The extreme embittered faction fights, which are really personality struggles among careerists there in their structure. So that's the prelude, right? That the world, for the moment, is not collapsing around our ears, right? The European Union goes on. The nihilists have been rebuffed, right? Not everybody in the world is crazy. Very important points. But now, what do we have this week? The Sally Yates testimony, to be sure, on Monday. And then the day after, my God, how fast things have gone, the firing of the FBI director, Comey. Now, we're no fan of Comey. We're against Comey. We thought what Comey did was horrendous. However, you got to make some distinctions. For Comey to resign is one thing. For Comey to be fired by Obama would have been the answer, right? Fire Comey. That's what Obama should have done. But to have the target of Comey's investigation fire Comey, no. That is totally unacceptable. And now to have the target of Comey's investigation threaten to appoint what Tubin of CNN calls a stooge, in other words, a puppet, a marionette, a pliable operative, well, that's unacceptable, because the goal of that would be the goal of this entire operation, which would be to shut down the Russiagate investigation. The Russiagate investigation must be rigorously, I would even say ruthlessly, pursued all the way. Again, let justice be done, no matter what the consequences. And that's, I think, what's at stake. So it is not acceptable for the target of the investigation to fire the investigator and then imagine that they're going to be able to appoint a new investigator with the idea that that person will shut down the entire thing. So that is our approach. It's not an endorsement of Comey. And remember, we are not the last judgment for Comey. In other words, we're not here to add up the pluses and minuses of Comey's life and then come to a total verdict, an aggregate verdict on what he did. We have to look at what he's doing right now. And what we can see with Comey is that for various psychological reasons of his own, bound up with his own vanity, absolutely bound up with his own vanity, he seemed to be determined to take this all the way. We'll be back on that theme in just a minute here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, urging you, pointing out that it is indispensable to subscribe to the daily American System briefing. Go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. Comey's vanity. Comey is obviously concerned largely with himself, with his own reputation. Some see in him a sanctimonious hypocrite. Well, from time to time, no doubt. But he was humiliated and mortified by the response of a majority of America, I think, to his blatant meddling and interfering in the election. He appeared to be a Republican partisan coming out to badmouth Hillary Clinton in July, and then the infamous October 28th letter saying, we've gotten new emails from Huma Abedin and Anthony Weiner. We got to go through those, but you need to know, which, of course, the Republican congressman then immediately leaked. They were part of that, right? Comey didn't send that to the press. The Republicans did. They thought it helped them. And therefore, the denial that came a few days later, a week later, came too late. The damage had been done. So Comey realizes that his name was mud, and the people who are going to write the history regard him as a partisan and a bungler. So I think it's not exactly conscience, it's wounded pride with Comey. He was determined to pursue a thorough, rigorous, hardline Russiagate investigation. And this was intolerable to the tenant of the White House. We know, thanks to the reporting from yesterday, from the, I guess this must be the New York Times or the Washington Post. These are small technical questions. We are told that friends of Comey have rebelled against the version peddled by Sarah Huckabee Sanders in the last 2 days, Wednesday and Thursday. The claim there was that, Trump in his Lester Holt interview said that he had 3 contacts with Comey and that Comey had assured him thrice, 3 times, that Trump was not a target of the Russiagate investigation. Now, this is most likely an invention. This is most likely invented more or less out of whole cloth. But there, we have to note in passing, in the case of Nixon, it took him until October 17th, 1973, to make his famous "I am not a crook" speech. But in this case, we didn't have to wait. We had Trump building into the letter, "Thank you for exonerating me 3 times." And then with Lester Holt, he told me 3 times that I am not a target, and therefore I state categorically to you, Lester, I am not a target. Apparently, the tenant of the Oval Office felt that his own staff were not vehement and categorical enough in denying this, so he decided to go into the arena himself with catastrophic results, as we're seeing. But now, that was the denial. But the people from the Comey circle are telling the press that it was Trump who demanded the dinner meeting with Comey at the White House, and that during that dinner, Trump demanded a declaration of loyalty to himself personally, not to the Constitution, not to United States interests or anything of the sort, but to Trump personally. This is unheard of, right? Swearing the loyalty oath. In order to find a government where you had to swear a loyalty oath to a person, you probably have to go back to the Wehrmacht, the German military, in the 1930s, when they were required to swear an oath to a person, not to a constitution, not even to a country, but to a person. So that's the story of the dinner. The Comey circle says it was Trump who demanded it, and he used this to demand loyalty. According to this, said, I can offer you honesty. That's not good enough. This is confirmed today by Clapper, the former head director of national intelligence, who said that at his own send-off on January 27th, Clapper met Comey, and Comey mentioned, hey, by the way, I'm invited to the White House tonight. I'm not sure I should go. I'm afraid the optics might look bad. It might look like some kind of collusion. We try to avoid this, but I don't feel that I can reject an invitation from the President of the United States. So Clapper gives a kind of confirmation. And by the way, Clapper is mentioned today in a series of Twitters, which we're going to discuss, where Clapper, these Twitters by Trump essentially say, Clapper has exonerated me. Clapper says that I'm not a target. They have no evidence of collusion. Clapper came on television today with Andrea Mitchell to say, look, I simply don't know this. I didn't know about the investigation, and I've been out of the government since January 20th. So we are hoping that Comey will be able to come and testify to the United States Senate next Tuesday. He should. Whether or not he likes it, he should definitely do that. Now, this gets us into a very fateful period of time. It is the time marked off by the 26th and the 27th of January that we've just gone through. The 26th and the 27th of January. We know from Sally Yates on Monday that she called the White House and she wanted to report to them that General Mike Flynn had been compromised by foreign intelligence agencies and was possibly subject to blackmail by them. Her first meeting at the White House was with the White House lawyer McGahn on the 6th of January. She was then called back on the 27th of January, that Friday. We now are told that Comey's dinner with the president came on the 27th of January. So it means that this could have been a response. In other words, Yates is there to say, we here in the Department of Justice, meaning the FBI as well, are aware of these contacts between Flynn and, well, presumably various Russian actors, including possibly the ambassador. And the response of the White House to that is not to fire Flynn or to focus on the investigation of Flynn primarily, but mainly to turn to Comey and the FBI and lodge with them the request for loyalty, which appears to be an interference with the investigation. The word that now emerges is obstruction of justice. Obstruction of justice. And we'll talk about that in just a minute here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington. Now, this morning at 7:26 a.m., real Donald Trump tweeted out to the world, James Comey better hope that there are no tapes in quotes, of our conversations before he starts leaking to the press. This has gone out 18,000 times on Twitter. Tapes. Oh my God. We were already noticing that the events of this week bear an uncanny, eerie resemblance, a very close resemblance after all these years to the Watergate crisis, which ended the Nixon administration between 72 and 74. And indeed, we're now we're inhabiting a mental, historical, cultural, political terrain, which is that of a Watergate scandal, a constitutional crisis of this magnitude. It simply means that if Trump is being investigated for Russiagate, he disrupts the inquiries. He fires Yates of the Justice Department. He fires Preet Bharara. He actually fires all the U.S. attorneys. Maybe that's a routine action, but not in the immediate, abrupt way that it was done. And of course, Sessions is up to his neck in all of these things, right? He's working along. And unfortunately, this guy, Rod Rosenstein, the deputy of Sessions, is also not to be trusted. I saw an interesting, a person, a somewhat erratic individual on Twitter, writing that if you don't endorse Rosenstein, you're no good, because the Kremlin wants to get Rosenstein out now and have Trump appoint his replacement. The problem with that argument is that Rosenstein is already a Trump appointee. So I'm afraid we cannot believe deeply in Rosenstein. Rosenstein spent decades building up a reputation, probity, integrity, and all that. He was a decent man and a fine prosecutor, according to all of these Democrats who voted for him like idiots, including Senator Warner of Virginia. Right? It shows that the right-wing Democrat outlook on the world is flawed. It doesn't work. It's not viable, cannot fly. but 30 years of work to assemble an investigation, to a reputation, and now within less than a month, the reputation is gone. You can forget that. He might redeem himself, right? He might come back in as a penitent, and we urge him to do it by appointing a special prosecutor. But if there's no special prosecutor, there's no hope for this reputation of Rod Rosenstein. So the outcome now is that there's a taping system. Here's the Twitter that we've just gone through. James Comey better hope that there are no tapes of our conversations before he starts leaking to the press. So this was one of the centerpieces of today's White House briefing. Spicy was back. Hucksterby had had her 2 days in the sun. Spicy is back, not just on 59th Street and Fifth Avenue, but also in the White House briefing room. And the answer is the president has nothing to say about this. The president has nothing to add. In effect, no comment. Questions included, does the White House tape everybody in the Oval Office? Do you have a taping system? Is the taping system going on? This is the national nightmare, redivivus. The national nightmare has come back to haunt us once again, and that is the famous Nixon Watergate taping system. Just as a brief reminder for those of you who didn't live through this, Nixon, President Richard Nixon, in 1971 installed a Sony tape deck. I believe this was reel-to-reel, old-fashioned tape deck, not even cassettes, but reel-to-reel. In the White House, it was voice-activated. It recorded everything. Everything was bugged. Everything was taped. All conversations. Now, this became known through the testimony of Alexander Butterfield. Butterfield was a deputy to H.R. Haldeman. H.R. Haldeman was the chief of staff of the Nixon White House. He's the equivalent of Reince Priebus. So the Priebus of 1972-73, who then went to jail, was this Butterfield. Butterfield was hauled in to testify at the Senate Watergate Committee, and on the 13th of July, 1973, revealed the existence of this taping system. And of course, as soon as the probers and the snoopers began to realize that everything was on tape, they began demanding the tapes. And that issue, for the next year, from July 73 to August 74, when Nixon resigned and went home in disgrace, that issue was the center of the entire scandal. So I wonder what Trump is thinking. He says, Comey better hope that there are no tapes of the conversations. Yeah, he's not the only one who better hope, because it was the taping system and the tapes that brought down Nixon. If Nixon had not taped all this stuff, he might not have ever had to leave office. And we're talking about two things in particular. One is, well, there are more phases to it than that. There's a phase where Nixon, of course, they're immediately demanding to see the tapes, right? They want the tapes. Public opinion wants to hear the tapes. As soon as they know there are tapes, as of the 13th of July, 1973, they want to hear them. So Nixon says, okay, I'm not going to give you the national security tapes. I'm not going to give you Soviets. I'm not going to give you Middle East. I'm not going to give you China. I'm not going to give you all this stuff. But I will give you the ones that bear on it. I'll give you 9 tapes. And it turns out that there are key conversations that were established during the Sam Ervin Senate committee hearings that were on tape. So the subpoenas focused on these tapes. And, well, it turned out that there were 9 tapes in the subpoenas, but 2 of these conversations Nixon claimed had never been taped because they took place somewhere else in the White House, not in the Oval Office, or on some other phone or somewhere else. And here's what Nixon writes in his memos. I was sure that a full explanation of how and why the phone call to Mitchell, Attorney General, went to jail, this is the Sessions equivalent, and the meeting with Dean, White House counsel, the McGahn, had failed to be recorded would clear things up completely. And as Nixon then adds, tragically and with cynical naivete, I simply did not understand the degree of public anticipation that had developed around these 9 subpoenaed tapes. Now I can see that it was largely the result of the degree to which my personal credibility had sunk. Personal credibility? Well, if Nixon laments that by October, November 1973, his personal credibility was low, what could we say about the current situation where personal credibility is clearly in tatters? There was then the 18-minute gap in the tapes, never explained. Nobody knows what was on there. I think it must have been something really damning. And then finally, the thing that was the 18 minutes, of course, led to a further collapse in that elusive personal credibility, since most people concluded that this had been erased. And then came the smoking gun tape of August 1974, immediate prelude to departure, resignation, out. Back in a minute. Welcome to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. We're speaking to you from the vortex, from the maelstrom of a constitutional crisis, and we're all called upon to be active. You got to do things every day. We now have social media. This is a great dimension. Get active. Go to Webster G. Tarpley on Twitter and retweet some of those things, because of course you want to go there. I try to keep you up to date. I give you links to the principal articles of the day, and also reflect and summarize the various events, right, so that you're up to date. We're going to talk about subpoenas in a minute. We're going to talk about the raid of the Strategic Campaign Group in Annapolis, Maryland, and how that fits in, the various subpoenas to Flynn and his associates that have been issued, right? We've gone a long way. We've got a grand jury now this week that we know about, and we've got subpoenas going out, and we've got a raid. So very, very interesting events. Back then, though, it was the smoking gun tape. Now, you want to get a good line on what really happened. You want to go, among other things, to tarpley.net. Look on the left-hand side of the page, George Bush, the unauthorized biography. Many have forgotten George Bush, George H.W. Bush, Bush the Elder, was a key Watergate figure. He was the head of the Republican National Committee. He was the equivalent of what Reince Priebus was last year. The chapter is chapter 12, Chairman George in Watergate. You're going to want to read this online. Then you're going to want to make sure you have a copy for your personal library so you can read the entire thing. And here we have the chapter about the smoking gun tape. Now, the smoking gun tape means a conversation on June 23rd, 1972, where Nixon and Haldeman, Chief of Staff, discuss how to obstruct justice, how to stop the investigation of the Watergate break-ins. And one idea is to go to the CIA, try to play the CIA against the FBI, tell get somebody at the CIA, maybe General Vernon Walters or somebody, to tell the FBI, you're delving into one of our CIA operations, butt out, leave us alone, and try to liquidate the entire thing. So this is a discussion about obstruction of justice that happened soon after the Watergate burglary, or better yet, the last Watergate burglary, the one that was that these guys deliberately made sure was discovered after they'd been there a couple of times and hadn't been discovered. So on the 4th of August, 1974, right, towards the end of the scandal, the smoking gun tape was revealed. You can read the whole smoking gun tape on the internet. Remember when they're talking about the Texans? The Texans is a group that includes George H.W. Bush. You can find all this in the Bush biography. So it's got a question of what the Texans are going to have to do. What do they testify to? The various money and so forth. Anyway, this was the final blow. This is the thing that forced Nixon to resign. This was August 5th, 1974, the release of the smoking gun tape, and Nixon resigned the presidency within just a few days, I believe on August 9th. And this was the moment when all the trees in the forest fell. Every tree in the forest would fall was one of the threats issued in the intelligence community at this time. So now the idea is, if you're the president and you announce that you have a taping system, what's going to then happen is people are going to try to subpoena those tapes, investigators, right? If there are any, if the Democrats ever take the House, and you better make sure they do. You better ruthlessly put aside all other issues and say the only way you're going to get back to law and order and having rights and being protected from unlimited caprice and absolute brutality, you better get a restoration of checks and balances for the purposes of law and order, right? And the call is to the Republicans, stop being Republicans, start being Americans, right? Start being civilized people and not Republicans. So that is what is opened up. Now the Twitters of this morning they seem to reflect a kind of a mood of threat. So there's a threat to Comey, right? I'm going to expose you. Comey had been quoted in the New York Times saying that he thought that Trump was outside the bounds of normal and crazy. So interesting, and that obviously rankled, and we haven't heard from Comey yet. So Trump claims that Clapper has exonerated him. Clapper goes on TV to say it's not so. Comey better hope that there are no tapes. Well, if there are, that's bad for Comey. I don't know, is it? But it's going to be bad for the White House. There's also the threat to cancel all future press briefings at the White House and to hand out written responses. Now, the guy who did this was General de Gaulle of France, right? I think a very good guy, but autocratic for sure. Not like the U.S., right? He's not like this sort of, what can we say, plebeian democracy that we seem to have. No, General de Gaulle was, la grandeur et la dignité. So he wasn't going to take questions from the press. He took them in writing and he read the answers. And that was his idea of a press conference. He also says, I'm a very active president. My people can't keep up with everything. Early in the morning, he said, the fake media is working overtime. Trump also thinks that Russiagate is a witch hunt, as he says today. It's a witch hunt. It's a ruse. It's a hoax. Are we in the realm of obstruction of justice? This is now something mooted on perfectly respectable establishment news broadcasts on cable television. It's a fabrication. The story that there was collusion between Russians and Trump campaign was fabricated by Dems as an excuse for losing the election. So he also says Russia must be laughing up their sleeves, watching as the U.S. tears itself apart over a Democrat excuse for losing the election. Well, this is, of course, the point that, unfortunately, Russian intelligence tends to support political candidates in this phase that disrupt the lives of their country, that cause tremendous increase in social tension, internal conflicts, faction fights, disruptions, paralyze the country, and prevent it from being aware of what's going on with the rest of the world. So is it a hoax, a ruse, a witch hunt, a fabrication? And is that an attempt to intimidate the investigators or or not. Now, let's just, since we're talking about this, we've done this on the other program, but it's indispensable to do it here. What's the Saturday Night Massacre? Well, once it was clear there were tapes as of July, then there was a special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, Harvard law professor, bow-tie liberal, to be sure, who wanted to delve into all of these things, and Nixon did not want to cough up these tapes. He tried to withhold them. And then we had endless legal complications, and eventually Nixon became so enraged, and he feared that he'd have to disgorge these tapes. So at that point, he decided that he would fire Cox. Right? He's the president. Cox works for the Justice Department, but that's still the executive branch. And Nixon decided he wanted to fire Cox. And we'll tell you that story in just a minute, because without it, you can't understand these allusions that are going on everywhere. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley, Washington, D.C. It's the afternoon of Friday, the 12th of May. All right, so this past Tuesday, we had the Tuesday afternoon massacre. Does this take us back to the Saturday Night Massacre? There have been other massacres. There was Gerald Ford's Halloween massacre. Look that one up. It was to get rid of certain people, cut down on Kissinger with a view to the 76 election, which he lost anyway. But that was the Halloween massacre. But now we've had the Tuesday afternoon massacre. This past Tuesday afternoon, the firing of Comey. All right, the Saturday Night Massacre is the main turning point in the history of the Watergate affair. It's very ominous for the current administration. Man, they should have done everything to avoid this. So, as we said, Nixon wanted to get rid of the special prosecutor or independent counsel, Archibald Cox. Cox worked for Elliot Richardson. Elliot Richardson, attorney general, like Sessions. But of course, this was a liberal Republican, a blue blood, had gone to Harvard, had actually been taught by Archibald Cox, his mentor. So there had been an attempt to keep Richardson on board but get rid of Cox. It failed. You can read all about this in RN, the Memoirs of Richard Nixon. I'm using his own account. There are others, of course, right? Any number of books on Watergate. But it gets to be October 20th, 1973. The legal system is closing in. They want to get those tapes. Nixon is determined not to disgorge the tapes. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Nixon's chief of staff, Haig, calls Richardson. Haig, of course, being the same as Priebus. Haig calls the Attorney General Richardson, Sessions, and says, got to fire Cox. Richardson says, no, and I'm coming over to the White House to resign. And he was determined to resign. So Nixon says, yeah, but think about what this is going to look like to the Soviets. I don't care. I'm resigning. Richardson's deputy, William Ruckelshaus, next in line as Attorney General, Nixon says to him, fire Cox. He also says, no, I'm quitting, or resigned. Resigned or fired. There is a quibble about this. It's clear. Fox News claimed that Comey had resigned. This was false. He was fired. But in this case, with the Watergate stuff, it's not clear in this particular instance. All right. The third-ranking official in the Justice Department was the Solicitor General Robert Bork of later Supreme Court hearing infamy. The resignations of his 2 superiors placed Bork in a painfully difficult position, but he was a constitutional scholar, and he knew that Nixon had the constitutional right to fire Cox, and therefore he was willing to do it. So at 8:22 p.m. on Saturday, October 20th, 1973, Press Secretary Ron Ziegler, read Sean Spicer, went to the White House briefing room and announced that Cox was being fired. Richardson and Ruckelshaus had resigned, and Nixon was trying to abolish the office of Watergate Special Prosecutor and bring those functions back into the Justice Department. Now, this was the firestorm. This is really the beginning of the end of Nixon, less than a year in the future. Carl Rowan of the Washington Post asked, has President Nixon gone crazy? Hey, this week we've heard crazy from Comey in the New York Times. Ralph Nader, who was around then, said Nixon is acting like a madman, a tyrant, or both. Edmund Muskie, Democratic senator from Maine, this smacks of dictatorship. Teddy Kennedy says it's a reckless act of desperation by a president who has no respect for law and no regard for men of conscience. Democratic Senator Robert Byrd, West Virginia, the Cox firing is a brown shirt operation using Gestapo tactics. But now, the words are all interesting. Here's the important part. By Tuesday, October 23rd, so 3 days after the Saturday Night Massacre, there were 21 impeachment resolutions in play on Capitol Hill. Varying stages of discussion. 21 impeachment resolutions. 6 newspapers, complains Nixon, that had formerly been supportive called for his resignation. On October 30th, in a straight party line vote, the House Judiciary Committee had voted itself subpoena power. On November 15th, the House voted to allocate $1 million to begin the process of impeachment. Now, the other question, of course, is what's the tipping point? And the tipping point is in 1964, the following year, there's a congressional election, of course. So here's what Nixon says about it, right? This is the best face you could put on it, which is what he's trying to do. The political prospects for Republican members of the House and Senate who faced re-election in November 1974 continued to worsen. I, Nixon, believed that the two issues of prosperity in the domestic economy and peace in the world, those same two issues that had swayed off-year elections for as long as I had been in public life, would ultimately tip the balance in this one too. But many prospective candidates apparently felt that Watergate was going to overshadow everything else and that they would have a better chance to win with Jerry Ford as president. That's the tipping point. In March of 1974, Republican Senator James Buckley of New York became the first so-called conservative to turn against Nixon. And we're told a poll in the city of Washington showing that 84% of the people thought that Nixon's people, who by then were on trial, right? The Attorney General, Mitchell, the White House Chief of Staff, Haldeman, the White House Domestic Czar, Ehrlichman, other White House officials, Colson, Mardian, Strachan, Parkinson, and so forth, all indicted, all on trial. Nixon complains they never got a fair trial because of the public opinion. All right. So I would turn to this, right? Notice Richardson says no. Ruckelshaus says no on firing Cox. The one who says yes is Bork. Reagan attempted to reward Bork with a place on the Supreme Court, but he was borked. Now, borked, to be borked. This is a name. It's like boycott, right? Captain Boycott goes into the language as a boycott and so forth. Bork exists as a transitive verb to bork and also as a reflexive verb to bork oneself. We'll explain this in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So that's the example of Watergate, a not so distant mirror, and the parallels once again are absolutely uncanny. They are uncanny. To bork, a transitive verb to bork. Teddy Kennedy borked Reagan's Supreme Court nominee. To bork somebody is to defeat their nomination, usually for the courts, but anything. To bork somebody is to use their own words, right? Use their own history, the opposition research that you have, to discredit them. So Judge Bork was borked in his confirmation hearings at the Senate back in the 80s, the middle to late 80s. But it's also I think now it's emerging as a reflexive verb, right? To bork oneself. And this would be my call to Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein, right? You can go into history as a bork. In other words, you can bork yourself if you continue to serve not the law or the Constitution, but rather the orders of those in power. 30 years of reputation. Rosenstein was the longest-serving United States attorney ever in Baltimore, here in Maryland, and he passed 94-6. Blumenthal, Connecticut, gets a highly laudatory grade for being one of the Democrats who voted against him. We had Warner, the right-wing Democrat from Virginia, blathering about what a great guy, how eminent, what a fine, decent fellow, all this stuff. It's really crazy. That was Warner who supported Rosenstein. And on the first night of this crisis, right after Comey had been fired, we had Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, who I thought had been improving. Turns out to be completely rudderless and clueless, because he goes on Maddow and he says to Maddow, you know, this is a cri de coeur. This is a really heartfelt call from Rosenstein that he's just appalled by what Comey had done in the election, right? Torpedoing Hillary Clinton through his various antics. And I guess she was speechless. She didn't know what to say, but she didn't have a ready response. So again, these people, Warner has now repented. Warner says he wished he had his vote back. Whitehouse ought to have a self-criticism session on the air sometime, saying, "Look, I was disoriented. I didn't know what hit me," and so forth. So, what's necessary, as the New York Times requests, it's time for a special prosecutor. That should be an eminent person. How about Sally Yates as special prosecutor? She would know what to do. Or if she's busy running for governor of Georgia, which would improve public life in that place, why don't we think about Preet Bharara? Preet Bharara could be a wonderful special prosecutor. Now, I also have to note of personal privilege here. I was saying before, in a quite disinterested way, that the best special prosecutor in my experience as a political observer is Lawrence Walsh of Iran-Contra. So he was in there from 1986 until 1993 or so. He indicted lots of people in the Bush or Reagan-Bush administration. He was frustrated because George H.W. Bush insisted on pardoning a bunch of CIA cronies at various times. It was this probe, by the way, that finished off George H.W. Bush right before the 1992 election. Anyway, Lawrence Walsh, there's a model of what an independent prosecutor, independent counsel special prosecutor should be. I was delighted to find this week that he had been a graduate of Flushing High School in Queens, that great center, the oldest public high school in the New York City system, my alma mater, and therefore this eminent personality can now be attributed to the wonderful atmosphere of Flushing, Queens, and the oldest high school in the New York City system. He had been the United States Attorney for the Southern District in Manhattan. He had then gone on to be Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General from about 1957 to 1961 in the Eisenhower administration. And then he was tapped in 1986, in somewhat advanced years, to become the Iran-Contra special prosecutor, and the best one, as far as I can see, in recent years. So I think that's the challenge now to Rosenstein. You can choose your historical fate. Do you want to be a Bork, or do you want to show up as a hero, as a Lawrence Walsh, or maybe you can outdo him? It can certainly be done. The Watergate parallels, again, overwhelming. The tapes, the Saturday Night Massacre, and of course, this idea that on Wednesday, on Tuesday there was really no explanation coming from the White House for the Comey firing. On Wednesday it was that Rosenstein demanded that Comey be fired. That was the Wednesday line. Now we're told that Rosenstein felt that he was being used. He said, stop making this look like my decisions. I didn't demand that. You read his memo, he tells you a bunch of stuff about Comey. A lot of that is true. But he doesn't say fire him. He just says, look, these are the things he did wrong. Then on Thursday, in the Lester Holt interview, Trump says, look, I made the decision. I didn't wait for any opinion. I was glad to see that opinion, but that was my decision a priori, regardless or irregardless of whatever was going to happen or not happen. I was for firing Comey. So we've had, I am not a crook. I was exonerated 3 times, and so on down the line. Now, subpoenas. As I say, it seems almost impossible to realize, but at the beginning of this week, we were not aware of the grand jury operating, we believe, in the Eastern District of Virginia, that is to say, Alexandria. I know something about this place. I covered a case. I've actually covered 2 cases in the period in the late 80s, and then about 10 years ago, we had the Moussaoui trial. It was located there. And that's the rocket docket, right? It's an interesting jurisdiction because the jury pool tends to be made up of government workers, people who may not feel too much sympathy for an administration which has spewed its dislike, its scorn for government workers. Well, that's who lives in Alexandria, and that's who's in the jury pool of the rocket docket. The other thing is they move fast. I would also argue they may move too fast for many defendants, right? If you're just a private person, you don't have any special time, and the government has all those resources. It seems to be one-sided. But anyway, it's going to be the rocket docket. They have now put out a bunch of subpoenas. The subpoenas have gone to General Michael Flynn, according to all the press reports, and to business associates. So yesterday, we have to assume there were multiple subpoenas served on Flynn and others somehow associated with Flynn. Then the Senate Intelligence Committee under Burr and Warner is also reported to have put out one subpoena to Flynn. This is the, I guess it's a duces tecum, right? This is, come and bring the documents. We've asked you for documents voluntarily. You haven't provided them. We're now subpoenaing them. You're now under order to bring them. And then, coming up, the story of the Annapolis raid. Back in a minute. Welcome to the final segment of this edition of World Crisis Radio, the 12th of May. We're taping. Remember, mark that date, June 3rd, the March for Truth here in Washington, D.C. By the way, we didn't have time to go through this, right? But ultimately, this is what's going to really count. That already at noon on Wednesday, right, the day after Tuesday afternoon massacre, there was a protest outside the White House. We had, Washington Post says, several hundred at lunch hour, a last-minute protest against the Trump administration, not really pro-Comey, but in favor of a special prosecutor. Will Wydrow, 71-year-old retired teacher from Rockville, says, fire the comb-over, not the Comey. An administrator at the Johns Hopkins University, I'm here because there has never been a point in our history when our democracy has been more severely threatened than it is now. It's incumbent on the Republicans in Congress to stand up and fight this travesty. Shame, shame, fighting for our country. And take a look at this picture, all kinds of choice epithets being thrown. It's an extraordinary moment. There are people organizing the March for Truth in Washington and New York. Check New York. Washington and New York, June 3rd. I believe they're up to 25 cities, but we'll see. As the tagline says, restore faith in American government. We've looked at their demands. We discussed their demands on the American System show. Their demands are very weak. Their demands are now obsolete. In other words, you've got to be demanding a special prosecutor, a Lawrence Walsh, a Cox, a Jaworski, to go in there and establish the facts, right? And a tough prosecutor. And, of course, you may also want to have a Kane-Hamilton commission, but not of the same sellout variety. And you may also want to have a third thing, might be to have a joint congressional committee. Why not have all three? Let's get the facts. The people have a right to know. So that was at the White House, Lafayette Park, noon on Wednesday. And then we're looking forward. We're also saluting the people who showed up at the various town hall meetings. In particular, the most moving, the bluntest, right, the most heartfelt was the town hall meeting of Congressman MacArthur of New Jersey. This is a renegade member of the Tuesday Group who went over and did a rotten compromise with the Tea Party Freedom Caucus. And again, one guy says, if your bill goes through, we're going to die. You are the greatest threat, he says to this stunned congressman. You're the greatest threat to the lives of my family. You personally are the greatest threat to the lives of my family, the people that I love. So again, nothing focuses the mind like the idea that somebody is coming after you with homicidal intent. This is the reality. That is what that health bill will do. It is a monstrosity. It is unbelievable. So now we've got the convergence of the health bill, the Trump care, Ryan care, the attack on Obamacare, and now we've also got Russiagate and Comey coming together. This is an explosive combination. People come to me sometimes and ask, how's the world going? I would say this mass mobilization is already deeper and more powerful than anything seen against Nixon in Watergate, which was not primarily located in the streets. Of course, a lot of it was, but that was not the main theater. So, the Annapolis raid. As of yesterday, we're watching our local TV, WBAL, Baltimore, and Channel 11, right? The I-Team. And it turns out that the FBI showed up in Annapolis, Maryland, right? Home of the Naval Academy, the capital of Maryland, right? The oldest functioning state house in the United States. And they raided the offices of Strategic Campaign Group. It is a Republican firm. They do money distribution. They do all sorts of stuff, right? We're not even going to try to exhaust the catalog of what they do. And there they were. The FBI was in there, and they used black garbage bags to cover up the windows while they were inside. A raid. FBI searches Republican political consulting firm in Annapolis, writes the Washington Post. Authorities are retrieving documents related to the firm's campaign work. Now, got to thank Jane Miller. Jane Miller, valiant local reporter for WBAL Baltimore. She points out the website of the firm raided by the FBI says that one of its principles, a principle of the Strategic Campaign Group, was formerly with a firm, and I have to correct what she writes, it's a firm that descends from the Manafort Stone law firm. Get it? We go from Strategic Campaign Group through one of their top 3 or 4 people. That guy shows in his resume that he comes from a firm currently in existence which descends in a linear way from Manafort and Stone. Both of them are under a great deal of public attention for Manafort's role having been hired, it's alleged, by a guy called Deripaska to improve the image of Russia and Putin here in the West. This is some years ago. And then, of course, Roger Stone, who is an object of great interest because of his many media contacts, let's say. So this looks very interesting. In other words, the hypothesis would have to be that the raid on this election consulting firm in Annapolis, Strategic Campaign Group, somehow leads back to the Manafort Stone circles. And of course, these are an integral part of the Trump for president campaign, in the case of Manafort, the head of it, and the broader mobilization effort, the social media, public diplomacy, which would include Stone, that other person. So, grand jury is going. We're told that it was an armada of federal marshals arraigned on Thursday at the Eastern District courthouse there in Alexandria. They then went out. This was presumably the associates of General Flynn. Who knows how many associates? We don't know any of this stuff. But we're looking forward to it. So a grand jury and subpoenas, and also subpoenas from Congress, have not been subpoenas from that Senate committee for a very, very long time. Now, back to our initial theme, right? Melissa McCarthy. If you look at Saturday Night Live any week, you will see the bankruptcy of the alienated comedy that we've had to put up with for decades, right? This sleazy, scurrilous, demoralizing, disorienting, depressing sleaze comedy. In other words, the comedy of the contempt for humanity. Contempt for humanity, that people are stupid, that they excrete, that they have a sexual faculty. All of this is used to express